it recording? Do you see that, Grace?
Yeah,
okay.
It's showing recording.
Sounds good. All right, thank you so much for joining us, everyone, today. My name is Amber Schultz. I'm a Wildlife Education Program Manager with the Fish and Wildlife Education Division here at Nebraska Game and Parks. And I'm presenting today with Grace. Grace, do you want to introduce yourself?
Sure, I am Grace Gard. I am aquatic ecology education specialist with the Education Division also.
Thank you. And this is the second to last Lunch and Learn series of the year. We do have one more, last one in December. It's Community Science 101 with Allie Mays, our community science specialist. And so we're really excited to hear what she has to say about community science in Nebraska. That'll be a great one. And I'll send the registration for that after this. So you guys make sure not to miss it if you'd like to join us. I'm also trying to finalize some topics for next year. I have some pretty good topics so far. I've got a lot of input and feedback from past surveys. So I appreciate everyone who has participated in the past sharing your feedback with me. That's always really helpful, and I've taken that into consideration. If you have any last minute cool ideas that you'd like to see or learn about next year during this series, I'd encourage you to share that in the evaluation that we send out after this. So thank you so much. Again, this is going to be recorded and it'll be available on our YouTube channel. So if you find this is helpful today and you want to share it with other staff, you're able to do so. But today we're going to be talking about storytelling and science. And before we get started with that, Grace and I do have a question for everybody that we want you to kind of reflect on and think about. So we want you to think about something really interesting, cool, exciting that you have learned recently, or a memorable learning moment in school that you still remember to this day. So I want you to kind of take a little time to think about that, and feel free to either write it down in front of you, wherever you are, or if you'd like to write it in the chat, you're welcome to do that as well. But we'll be coming back to this at the end. Take some time to think about what your answer would be for this. I know I have a few stories in my mind, a few moments in my mind for this. Okay. Hopefully you thought about something, you wrote it down, or it's in your mind. Something cool that you learned recently, or a memorable learning moment you had in school. But we're going to get started by talking about what is science. So what's the point of what we're chatting about today? We're talking about science communication, essentially a strategy of science communication, and one of it is storytelling. But before we talk about science communication, the reason that we'd want to improve that is because we're speaking to science in general. And what is science? Science is, there's probably a lot of definitions for this, but one of them that I resonate with is that it's the pursuit of unambiguous truth. It's a way of knowing about the world around us. And so it's a pretty lofty goal that science has, but really I think what's important to understand, especially in our conservation field, is first of all, it can improve the lives of humans. It improves the lives of us all around us. But also specifically in our field, it helps inform conservation practices. It helps us understand our own natural resources and how we can be better stewards to the land, because that's our mission as Nebraska Game and Parks. We're responsible for the stewardship of natural resources of the state. And so science obviously helps with that. And that's probably going to be a lot of our goal when we do science communication within our agency or within this field at large. And so what about the state of science communication? And that's really what we're going to be talking about today, an aspect of that. And before we get started, especially when we talk about different ways that we can use stories to bring science to life, it's important to remember that there's a big difference between doing science, actually conducting science, conducting research, getting data, analyzing results, things like that, and communicating science. And that might be pretty intuitive for most of us here, but if that's the first time we've heard that before, I just want you to kind of think about that and reflect on why there's a difference maybe throughout this presentation, because there certainly is. But where do people learn about science? So most of us know, when you're younger, we get some science in our formal schooling. How much you get or the quality you get depends on where you are, certainly, but that's where we're learning a lot about science. And that's when we're younger, we're students. And then some of us go on to educational institutions, college, universities. And so you'll get a bit more science there. But research has found that after we leave school, whether it's just formal schooling or after we leave colleges and universities, it's about, I think they said about 70% of what we get, of what we understand about science is through interpersonal discussion. So what you learn from your neighbor, and he shared some cool things he learned, or your family or friends, what they're talking about, the science that they're talking about, if they're talking about science. But really 70% of it is through mass media. And I put this graph here. You can see, so this is from the National Science Board in 2020. And they wanted to understand the primary source of where people got their news or their understanding about science over the last, sorry, I hid this so I can't see, since 2007, I believe. And so you can see there's kind of a trend here. There's a trend if you look right here, it's television was like their primary source, but that has moved to the internet as their primary source. All of these still represent mass media though. So whether you're seeing your scientific information or stories or messages from television, newspapers, magazines, or the internet, that's part of what mass media is. And what's important to understand when we talk about storytelling in science is that, often you'll get a little pushback from scientists. We'll talk about that kind of like the old school idea of science communication, but you'll get pushback of like, we don't need to be putting science into stories or narrative formats, because that's not what science is. It's logical, it's data-driven, it's evidence-based. But as you can see, and we'll talk about this throughout our presentation, if this is where the majority of non-expert audiences, so our adults out of school who are not in the scientist field, if mass media is the majority of where they're getting their science information, they're already getting narrative versions of science. So they're getting that message in narrative ways, and that because that's how mass media operates. And so it's more of a questioning whether narrative should be used to communicate science. It's a bit more of a moot point. A better question would be, how should we use narratives to communicate science appropriately and effectively? Because it's already happening. And so how can us in the science communication fields or the scientists themselves, how can we join that and actually make sure that accurate information is getting across? So I spoke a little bit to more of the old school thought on science communication, previous understandings of how we should be communicating science at large. It's called the deficit model. So that the deficit model worked with these three basic assumptions. And what they were that facts speak for themselves. So we need to get more facts out there. If we're doing a presentation or we're writing a story for the newspaper, or if we're discussing our research, it's just simply, we just share those facts. That will speak for themselves. Another assumption is information alone will make change. So if we tell people, a finding or research understanding, this information is going to help them create change in their life, whatever it may be. And if we're thinking about conservation, maybe we're thinking of stewardship practices. So maybe an example is, explaining about recycling and how when we recycle, we can save this much, from the landfills, and that helps animals. And that information alone will help encourage people to start recycling. And then the third assumption is all we need to do is just broadcast complete, accurate information. As science communicators, if we get the facts out there, if we broadcast it, then that is enough to really engage people in science. And so what over the last probably a few decades, as we're really studying, best practices in the science behind science communication, what we're understanding is that the deficit model, it's not necessarily wrong. It's definitely effective in some ways, but it's not the whole picture. It's inadequate. And so kind of working through those assumptions again, facts don't always speak for themselves. you can reflect on this if you've ever had an experience where maybe you're at the dinner table with a family member, a loving family member, and maybe there's a debate that's happening. And you decide, you know what, their argument isn't necessarily correct. I'm going to just give them more facts. And that will help change their mind. Maybe think of for a second, how did that work out for you? Because I know in my scenarios that didn't always work out. It's a lot more than just facts when we're talking, when we're discussing. The third assumption, or the second assumption about information alone will help make change. It's also not exactly the complete picture. Ideas, not just information, can help make change. So when people are plugged in and can relate and become motivated by ideas, where they share common goals or visions or values around those ideas, that's what helps motivate their behavior change for a certain direction. Say it's a stewardship behavior. And then the third assumption of just, we just need to broadcast more accurate information. That's, again, not the full picture. We use more than information to make decisions. So I'm sure a lot of us have some facts in our mind that, we've seen and we've learned. Say it's, we've heard that we need to get 10,000 steps a day in order to have a healthy heart, or we need to, screen time before bed is bad for our eyes and bad for our sleep. So those are facts. So those are helpful, right? And they're accurate information. But I'm sure we take a lot more into account when we actually make our decisions. Because I know that I don't get 10,000 steps every day. And I know that I still look at my phone at night often. And so there's more to it than just understanding facts. The takeaway from this, with kind of understanding science communication better and how we can get those messages across, is we need to make science meaningful and significant to our audience. And this is really key. And it's really thinking about that audience as well, because once you understand which audience you're working with or you're wanting to speak to, they're going to have different ways of things that are meaningful or significant to them. Okay, so what's the science behind stories? So today we're talking about storytelling as a part of science communication. And when we think about this, we want to think, how do people actually think? And how do stories help fit into that puzzle? So we all know that we're social creatures, which means we actually prefer social knowledge. We're social learners. That's one thing really cool and unique about humans, is we learn best from each other. And in that context, and we remember things better in social contexts, is when we can relate it to ourselves, our lives, our daily lives, and people around us. We also seek patterns and make connections. It's really important to us. Sometimes that goes a bit overboard. We look for patterns everywhere, and maybe we have wrong assumptions from that, but that's where science communication can help kind of uncover some of those patterns, those accurate patterns. Well, we think in terms of cause and effect. And so an example of this is most of the general public is perfectly happy with knowing that when they switch a light on, the light comes on. That's cause and effect. Not every single member of the public really cares or is interested to know exactly how that works. They're not interested to know exactly how the electricity goes through and all that actually works. They just know the basic cause and effect. You turn a switch, a light comes on. And so that's really how kind of the default thinking for humans. We're moved more by emotional connections than by logic. This one is really important. It's a bit antithetical to how science is actually done. When we're actually conducting science, we want to keep our emotions out of it. We want to keep ourselves out of it and all those things. And that's important to keeping things objective. But when we're communicating, it is important to kind of work with some of those emotions. And when people's emotions are engaged during a learning experience, they actually have a much better retention of that moment. They have a much better understanding of what they've learned. And we also have a complicated relationship with change. I really enjoyed reading about this one. It's interesting because basically what this means is that we want change as humans. If nothing ever changed in our lives, that would be frustrating, painful, and boring, I think. But we resist being changed. We are not a fan of, think about the last time maybe you got unwanted advice for someone. How did that feel? It doesn't feel very good when someone is trying to tell you what to do or someone lecturing you. But we respond better when we resonate with something that motivates us to change for ourselves. And so that's a really important aspect to remember. And so in thinking about this, it's also helpful to think about what is a story? What are the parts of a story that might be helpful to this? Well, a story has characters. Characters can be people, animals, objects, something with some kind of agency that we can identify and relate to. The story has a sequence of events, and so we like to follow along in that way. A story has some kind of tension, whether it's a type of challenge, a question to be answered, a problem to solve, some type of conflict. The point of this tension, what's important about this is tension in a story piques our interest. It motivates us to stay engaged with this learning in order to kind of find what resolution is going to happen. And then a story has a resolution and a meaning. And along with pattern seeking, we are meaning seeking species. So we look for meaning in everything. And so that's really important to why we engage so well with stories. And so the effect of stories, thinking about how humans think and then what stories are made of, stories actually are really helpful at showing patterns in familiar ways. And they're social. We identify with the characters, whether it's, like I said, an animal or a person or an object, we're still trying to identify. We're always trying to identify with the characters in a story. It also helps us navigate change in our imagination. So if we learn about the new science about like a way to be healthier in some aspect, but if we learn it in a story way, we're actually in our minds kind of putting ourselves in that story to feel out, ooh, I wonder if we could make this change. And you almost kind of practice that imagination muscle of making change. So the last thing to think about, I always get at least one little neuroscience nugget into most of my presentations, I feel, because it's so interesting, but a brain on stories is really, really cool. A lot of research has been done on how humans engage in storytelling or how they react to hearing or reading about stories. And lots of really cool things are happening behind the scenes. It increases our information processing on almost all levels. And so it increases our motivation and our interest, which helps us learn better. It also helps us transfer whatever we're learning into our long-term memory, which is really effective as well in learning. This is really cool. Some latest research has actually showed the brain activity of storytellers and listeners start to synchronize. And so when that happens, as a listener to a story, you're actually synchronizing your brain activity with the storyteller. And this leads to better comprehension of what was being told and better retention, so you remember it longer. And both of these factors are also really important for learning and motivating behavior change. And lastly, stories can strengthen your social cognition. So they do this by when you're reading, even if it's fiction stories or nonfiction, or if you're listening to a story, you're actually practicing this muscle of understanding multiple perspectives, which is really important in critical thinking skills. It's really important in learning about nuanced situations, which is really what science is. Science is not black and white. There's a lot of factors. So it's helpful to increase our understanding. I know I dove deep right now into some kind of behind the scenes, how we think, how do stories fit in? And now I'm going to hand it over to Grace, and she's going to talk about actual strategies of storytelling and how we can do that in sharing our science stories. Before I do, are there any questions? If you have any questions, make sure to put them in the chat. But feel free if you have any questions to let us know. I'll pause for a second.
Yeah, so we're going to talk about those storytelling strategies. We found some really fun resources when we were doing kind of some research for this presentation. And so one thing that we found we thought did a really good job of kind of laying out what are some 5 key strategies to kind of keep in mind, just practical things when you are implementing more of a storytelling approach to your education. So we included this great picture from an experience we had at with Girls Inc. out at where were we? Was that Platte Root? No, Two rivers, thank you. But yeah, even this is just kind of a cool example of how a photo can kind of tell a story. But we'll dive in first into putting a human face on what you do. So it is super important that you just that you make things kind of personal when you are maybe presenting information or you're taking this storytelling approach. So being able to connect to people and so that they can feel connected to you as a person instead of just kind of maybe some, mystery person that puts information out there. It really does help people to know your face sometimes. And I know as scientists, we like to use our data to make our point, but oftentimes the emotional aspect of that is where people are going to be able to relate. So a lot of times, we will kind of touch on it soon, but you can throw a lot of data at somebody, but if they have no personal connection, which I know Amber has talked a lot about in prior Lunch and Learn series of like, if someone has never interacted with that kind of information before, they can't relate to it. And so it's going to be really hard for them to make any sort of connection. So being able to use your own personal emotions in a way so that people can relate to your topic is going to be super important. And also like highlighting those shared experiences. So then kind of figuring out who the people are you're talking to. So you can kind of see maybe we do have shared experiences and you use those as you kind of tell your story. And then it's also really important to think about how this information that you want people to connect with is going to impact them in their real life. Because again, we go back to relating. If someone cannot see how, say we've got the chronic wasting disease or something, if someone can't understand how that could impact them personally or in their personal life, that's going to be really hard to get them engaged. So this is where connecting to people, really making sure you kind of put a face on things and it's not just some just objective person or organization that doesn't really say who they are. I think it's important to have that personal connection in there because that's where people all have these experiences and that's where they're going to be able to connect to you. So, yep, we'll go back out here and then into creating dramatic tension. So dramatic tension is basically like everyone knows a good story, a good movie, it has a challenge in it, right? So this challenge is kind of where the best stories start. And then it's followed by a journey. And so this really made me pause and think about in our fields, especially scientific fields, where do we start? And usually we're starting from a point where we have some problem or we have questions and we want to know more and we need to solve this. We're kind of like detectives in a way, right? And that is something that I think people are attracted to and they always want to know more about the story and where is it going to go from here. And so if we kind of shift our perspective a little bit and see some of those scientific studies or research that's being done, a lot of times it does have a challenge with it. And then there's a whole journey that is paired with that. And so I think that's a cool thing to keep in mind when you are kind of using that storytelling approach to help people connect to some sort of issue that you're caring about. And again, those ups and downs, those are the perfect things to talk about. That's what people can relate to because in our lives, we all personally have ups and downs. We have ups and downs at work. And so those are also going to be those times that you can take advantage of that and really use that within your information. We go to the next thing. Thanks, Amber. Again, this kind of touches back on like being personal in the first strategy, but connecting with your audience. And I think Amber's probably touched on audience quite a bit in other series too. So connecting with them and knowing who they are is such an important part of using storytelling in science communication. So do they understand the language you are speaking is the biggest question that you should ask yourself. Like when Amber and I were talking about this, we said, okay, could you go home and tell your high school daughter or son about this? Or could you tell your mom about it? Those are kinds of questions you kind of have to ask yourself, and make it in a language that you can also understand too, right? So that's important to think about and put it in perspective of, do they know that scientific jargon you're using? Because most of the time they don't. And then it's important to rethink what language you're using. So if we want to do a program or talk to anybody who's maybe in like kindergarten, that's going to be a very different language that we speak versus older students or even grandparents. Are we frozen, Amber?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Can you see me okay? I was just going to add to this. I recently saw this incredible video. It was kind of like a training video on science communication of this scientist, and his challenge was on YouTube, and there's lots of views. I'll send it in the follow-up as a resource. But his challenge was to explain the same concept, but he does it to a 5-year-old, a 12-year-old, someone in college, and then someone in the actual scientific field, and then adult not in the field. And he explains the same concept. It was something about brain science. And it was so cool what he did and how he kind of like changed the gears in his mind to connect and speak the language to each of those different audiences, because they all have different worldviews and perspectives and limited understanding. But he's got the same point across of what he was trying to teach. But to watch how he did it, it was really incredible. And it goes to show, Grace, what you're speaking to here. You know, a lot of times, I think in the past, when you're creating programs or you're writing messages or you're trying to work on some kind of science communication efforts, the audience was your last thought, because often you're thinking, this is the message we're trying to get across, or this is the data that we're trying, the research that we're trying to share, and whoever's going to listen would be great. But thinking about your audience almost first before you're making your program, presentation, whatever it may be, it's key, because you're going to be able to clue in on the type of language that you're going to speak to them. So this is a really, really important one.
Yeah. And then when you think through that language before you say what you're going to say, then when you do finally implement that, the information is going to land in that person's head, because it is spoken in some way that they can understand a lot better than someone who has, you know, years of research in a topic or something. So, and then the biggest part is it's going to stay there, right? And that's what we want to see happen, is we don't just learn something and then forget it, but we actually retain that. And that's a huge thing, no matter what age you're talking to, because all of these people, we want to instill conservation values in them. And so that's what our ultimate goal is that information stays with them. And again, empathy is also another key to knowing your audience. You've got to be able to kind of get on whatever level it is that they're at, and not necessarily that you're leveling down the quality of things, but you're just rethinking how you're speaking to them, and coming from a place of empathy where you care about what their past experiences have been. So. All right, the next strategy is being concise and using meaningful details. So keeping things simple is so vital. So keeping your message clear is one of the biggest things to think about. Also, besides knowing your audience ahead of time, the next thing you really want to make sure you're doing is know your message really well, what you want to say, and then keep it extremely clear. So don't overwhelm people with highly technical data that maybe won't land with them. It won't mean anything to them because they just don't have the personal connection to it that you have. And so that's important to keep in mind, is keeping that message super clear and cut things down so that it's only the essential information that is needed for them to understand the message you're trying to get across. And then it is really, really key to use graphics. But I kind of put this little computer icon on there too, because I've seen different presentations in the past where there is so much data displayed on a PowerPoint slide that I just I can't wrap my brain around it. And I'm sure other people have been in a similar situation before. And so that's why, you know, when you were learning how to make PowerPoints, it was like, don't put as much text as, you know, only put exactly what is needed to get that message across. And same with graphics, where I think that there's a lot of room to still explore how graphics are also helping people understand things. Like infographics are pretty fascinating to me. And so there's just a lot of things. There's a lot of ways to keep your message simple, but get all the necessary information across. So this one cannot be downplayed. It is very important to keep things simple.
I think something that's similar that kind of connects this and that audience one, the keeping it simple, but also knowing your audience, is one of the things that I've read is every step of the way when you're creating a presentation or a program or whatever it may be that you're involved in, you need to ask yourself, so what? And what that means is, why are they going to care about this? How are they going to derive meaning from this? I think we all are so passionate about all the things that we do, which is really helpful. But sometimes, and this happens to me often, and I have to always check myself, I have to remember that my passion, I might be living in a bubble, because even though I'm passionate about, let's say, recycling or conservation or all these things, it almost clouds my view and my understanding that not everyone holds those exact same values. So making sure that we're kind of taking a step back in that big picture approach. And just because we're passionate, excited, and about what we're speaking to, and our message is clear, we have to remember, how are we going to, keep it simple in a way that we're going to allow other people to, share that excitement as well, but in their own world. So this is a really good one.
Yeah, that's perfect. And then the final thing that kind of ties all these strategies together, sort of like Amber was saying, one of these strategies alone might not do the trick. So, but all together, I think they really create a strong approach to communicating scientific information. And being authentic is, again, kind of ties to that first one as well, of like putting a face on things. Being authentic is where you can really show your passion that's behind whatever scientific information that you're trying to share with people. So it's important for them, because even if they can't relate to the maybe really hard data that you have regarding a fish stocking, but they can relate to the passion that you're showing, because they might feel that kind of passion for something else. So that's really important to show. And then again, being aware of how you're speaking. So making sure you're not just like monotone, because people do tend to shut down, brains shut down a little bit when things are monotone. And just putting that emphasis on changing your tone of voice and thinking again about how you're speaking to people, because like this graphic where there's someone with a question mark or an exclamation point, if you're not kind of aware of how you are coming across, people might have red flags come up, like, oh, this person is just reading off their information and they're not even connected to this. They're just sharing it because it's straight from reading off of something, versus maybe if they can tell you're really authentic, then that's going to really engage them, because usually people, I think, are just naturally attracted to that kind of authenticity. So it's very important to make sure that you are being authentic as you present something. So that's kind of those 5 strategies that we use. I'm sure that there's maybe a few other types of categories that could exist out there, but we thought this was a really solid, just easy, practical set of steps to kind of keep in mind our strategies. Amber, do you have anything else to add about it?
Well, I think that's good. And I see, as we look at those strategies, I see how we can use those and have used those in the past, even in creating curriculum and programs and presentations and things. So it's really helpful. A lot of it feels intuitive, but putting stories into that science format maybe is less intuitive to scientists and researchers and things. It's cool to see the science behind why that's effective and helpful. Okay, are you ready to dive in, Grace?
Yeah, so the next thing we're going to do is do a little bit of diving in deeper into what these strategies look like, say if Amber and I are putting them into practice. And the topic that we chose to just focus on is, what is a mussel and why are they important in Nebraska? Because we know our fisheries and the hatcheries especially have been working on mussel projects. And so we wanted to kind of present their information to you in two different ways and just see what you notice about those two different ways and maybe what are the positives and negatives surrounding those. So I think Amber's going to go first and just share.
Okay. I think we also chose mussel because if you think about that connection, mussels are probably a lot less, it might be a little harder to get people excited about these cool creatures than it is, say, a river otter or something cute and fluffy.
They're not a charismatic megafauna.
Exactly. So I'm going to try to answer this question for you. What is a mussel and why are they important in Nebraska? So maybe that's our message that we're trying to get across. I'm going to try to answer this for you one way. So I'm just going to share with you the facts about it. So I want you all to know mussels are filter feeding bivalves, and native mussels have declined in Nebraska streams. Fisheries Division researchers have researched mussels and determined that the ones with lowest numbers. And they actually began reproducing and stocking the mussels in our local rivers. A fun fact, mussel larva is called Glochidia. I hope I said that right. Great. Glochidia, okay. Before a mussel is stocked, they attach a tracking device to it. Fishery staff have began to evaluate the effectiveness of mussel stocking, and mussels are indicators of healthy aquatic habitats. So I'm just letting you know the facts of this, and we can contrast that with more of a story-based approach.
Mel, I'm so sorry, I've already tuned out.
See, there you go. Thank you for that feedback, Mel. She has tuned out. Okay. Maybe let's hear about mussels with a different approach.
Yeah, so I'm going to share with you all about my mussel story because I did get to have some cool interactions with mussels last fall, I believe. And so I was actually out in Burwell at the Calamus Fish Hatchery doing some video work. Because this was kind of before we had a solid video crew, and I wanted to make some educational videos about what our fish hatcheries were doing and then potentially mussels in the future. So they were like, hey, we're going to this site. Will you come with us? And you can collect some video and some pictures of what we're doing. And this was all new to me. And I was like, sure, I'll come, and like followed them out on this long gravel road I literally couldn't find it again. I don't know where we were, but we were out and it was a beautiful day. That top left photo, I have that picture labeled in my computer as the perfect day because it was such a fantastic day. And I was just tagging along with all these fisheries guys and especially so it was Brian Sweet, who's at the North Platte Hatchery, and then Joe Cassidy was there from Grove, and you can see Josh in that middle picture from Calamus Fish Hatchery. So it was just really cool to get to tag along with them. And as I was with them, what they explained when we pulled up, we were literally just on a farmer's property that they have permission to be on and be in this stream. We were kind of getting out and getting ready and basically going to walk through this stream and look for mussels. And Amber mentioned a little bit, but mussels are a mollusk, and they are really fascinating because they are filter feeders. They essentially can process like 8 gallons of water through their system in one day. And so it's pretty crazy to think about how much water then is flowing through that mussel, and they're living filters so that they are filtering particles through their system. Some of it they eat, some of it they don't. Whatever they excrete becomes food for the macroinvertebrates in this water community. And so these guys had this project, I think it was the previous spring, they had gone in and stocked mussels in this stream. And it's really fascinating, like the reproductive habits of mussels, because there's 2 species they chose to focus on in this stream. It was the Plains pocketbook and then the fat mucket. Mussels have really fascinating names also. So these were the types of mussels they were looking for, and they actually had this whole complicated process that they used to breed these or reproduce mussels in their hatchery. And then they went and stocked them in the spring. And then there was a lot of flooding in Nebraska that year. And so they were going back to try to figure out, like, have these mussels established here, or are they all gone? Did they all get eaten? There's all kinds of things that they weren't sure. And so they went out, and I got to follow along. So you can see there's a tech in that upper right picture that has, he had a telemetry backpack on, and the reader, and basically they're looking for mussels that have a pit tag on them. So before the mussel is stocked, they glue with like dental glue a little pit tag onto the mussel. And you can, in the lower left picture, kind of see the mussel on the right has a little pit tag glued onto it. And then they're going through the water and looking for these. So this was kind of our big challenge, was basically, can we find any of these mussels? And it's also important to let you guys know that mussels don't move very far. They do have a sort of a foot that can help them move, but in their lifespan, which is really long, they don't move around very much. And so if they find all these mussels here, that's also a good indicator of water quality. So all around, that's why they were looking for them. And we looked for probably the first almost hour. We went down this stream one direction and didn't quite find anything. And then we kind of doubled back on one spot, and then they got a ping on their telemetry device. And then they were kind of split up into two teams, and I was just following. I got lucky to follow the team that found one first. So that's Josh in the middle. They kind of have to, dig down in the sand and see if they can find it under there, because usually mussels are buried under the sand. And then they did find one, and they pulled it out, and it was tagged, and they take different measurements on it, identify what kind of mussel it is. And so that was really exciting. So then it became kind of a competition of like, who can the next team find one too? And they did actually find quite a few. And it was also just like, you can see this stream was crystal clear. I'd personally never been to a location like this in Nebraska before. So it was really fascinating to just realize what kind of habitats we do have in our state, and also why it's so important to preserve our aquatic resources, and why mussels can be a really good indicator of that. And so when we were actually nearing the end of this too, we found like 2 mussels that weren't even tagged. We just somehow got lucky, and people were just looking around and being like, observant. And I found one, and then Josh also found one with just like no tag. It was just sitting there perfectly for us to find. So it was a total adventure and really fun to tag along with them. I didn't mention it, but that lower middle picture is a picture of what it looks like when how a natural, like wild living mussel reproduces, is they actually pretend that they're a fish to attract a fish to come swim by them, at which point they will actually dispel all their Glaucidia larvae, like shooting it at the fish. And their larvae are actually parasitic, so they'll latch onto the gills of the fish, and they'll live there for just like, I don't know, I think it's a week or a couple of weeks. And then when they're big enough, they will just drop off the fish. It doesn't kill the fish or anything. And then wherever they drop off is where they get to establish kind of their new territory. So it's pretty fascinating. And that's how mussels are able to really move themselves. Otherwise, they can't really move unless they attach to a fish that swims somewhere new. So really fascinating. And then really fascinating to think about what Brian and all that team has done to reproduce them in our hatcheries. So overall, just such a cool project. And it was really fun for me to get the chance to go out with them on this perfect September day and wade around in the water and look for these and assess really, how is this program doing? Is it doing its job? Are we going to be able to have native mussels in our waterways and help tell us about our water quality? So that's probably it for my story, but that's a different method of kind of sharing some of that information with you.
Mel, are there any comments on that story? Were you more engaged?
Hopefully.
Hopefully they didn't tune out. Oh, that was a really cool story, Grace. And I know when you shared that with me when you got back, one of the things that resonated was how passionate and excited that crew was. And Michelle said, I like the use of pictures. And Mel said, I'm here for it, totally engaged. That's really cool to be able to see, the story behind that science there.
Yeah.
All right. Are you ready for this one?
Yeah, so we're going to show you guys a science storytelling kind of a case study. It's not fully a case study, but it is a great example of a team that's doing work with Game and Parks to kind of tell a story about Nebraska's wetlands. So I think Amber's going to stop sharing quick, and I'm going to share with you this quick trailer. And some of you are probably familiar with the Wetlands Outreach and Education Project, but I wanted to be able to show this just as another example of how we're trying to engage people in nature and conservation concepts.
Wetlands are somewhat of a transitional zone between the uplands
and good, Amber?
The deeper water of a lake.
Yeah. Yep.
Okay.
Saline wetlands have a unique plant community that you really won't find in too many places in the state of Nebraska. They're close to an urban community where you feel like you're in a wild place.
The sandhills are mountainous sand dunes with wetlands peppered in between. The sandhills are magic.
The North Platte River in western Nebraska is such a unique landscape. It's hard to find another landscape as impressive.
Central Platte is internationally known, of course, for sandhill crane migration, and this plus the rainwater basins make a really important resource for ducks, geese, other water birds that are coming through.
If you think back to pioneer times, this whole area was nothing but open prairie. And then you had these pockets of wetlands out here in the rainwater basins embedded in that landscape.
Wetlands are everywhere. What makes Nebraska especially unique is that there's a ton of different types of wetlands. Without wetlands, you don't have this diverse array of species. It's super important that we protect these spaces.
Yeah, so we wanted to share that video with you, and I'll just give you a little background on that project. But that video is just one. There's actually a second clip that they've made as kind of like a teaser trailer. And it's really been fun to work with this group. So Ted LaGrange in Wildlife got a EPA grant to create these materials and update them from the last series he created in 2005. And it's been awesome to work with Platte Basin Time Lapse. They really get out in the field and they tell the story of, the wildlife and the people that are connected to the wetlands, and use really cool technology. So you saw there's a lot of drone footage. They've even been working on drone time-lapse footage. They've got regular time-lapse, trail cams, just all kinds of visual resources to really help tell the story of our wetlands and engage people in them. So Ben, just if you wanted to see a quick example, and if you go to that other trailer, they've even added good text in there so people can really see like, okay, here's the saline wetlands, here's the playa wetlands, so having text in there too, I think was a good thing they added in the second trailer. So yes, Megan, I'll be sure to share when Amber, I think, always emails you guys about feedback, we'll include the links to those trailers for you. Yeah, so that's a good example.
Okay, so coming towards the end here, and we just want to kind of wrap back to that question that we asked at the beginning. If you wrote something down or if you had something in mind, think about that memorable learning experience we asked you to think about. Do you recognize now, walking through the importance of why stories are an effective way to communicate about science, or why stories can be an effective way to engage learning? Do you recognize any of these strategies we talked about today within that learning experience? So Was there a face to that? Did someone make it personal? Did you see someone's passion shine? Was there an emotional experience to that? So kind of think about that. If you like to share, if you'd like to share with this reflection, please feel free to. Either you can take yourself off mute. It's a pretty small group today, so you can chat with us, or you can share in the chat if you recognize any of those strategies.
I always imagine someone frantically typing to try and
right.
get their thing out there, but.
Hey, this is Michelle.
Yeah.
I was just thinking about my thing was my high school ecology class, and just the passion that, you know, our high school ecology teacher had. And it wasn't just reading from the book, it was, you know, hands-on, really being engrossed in it, really being part of it. You know, he used our local stream, so there was like the connection that he was trying to create with us. So a few of those things, you know, that you talked about, that will always pin that memory in my head.
That's great, Michelle. Thanks for sharing that. I think that's really important. And I know, you know, there's so many similarities between science communication and science education. It's really kind of this overlapping field, but, you know, having someone model that, especially early on, their own passion and engaging other people, that's really, really important. And that's really part of it. Thanks for sharing. Anybody else? All right, well, thank you so much, everyone. If there's any other questions, let us know. Thanks so much for joining us today on our Lunch and Learn. And again, remember, next month is going to be all community science. We're excited to hear from Allie Mays about that. And then again, I'll be sending a evaluation. So if you have ideas about future topics, it'd be fantastic to hear from you, because I always want to know how to make this series, you know, best serving my audience. I'm trying to think about our needs as well. And I really enjoy us all being able to learn from each other here at the agency. Wait, we have a comment from Mel. Infographics are an awesome way to communicate complex ideas to an audience. I've designed a handful of infographics for the wildlife team, and it's always fun to figure out the story that will be the most effective to get the message across. That's awesome, Mel. Grace, do you have a comment on that? I know that you've chatted about infographics before. That's really cool.
It's something that I've been kind of being, it was a choice for a project for my grad class. And so I could do that or write a long paper. And I was like, well, I want to do an infographic. So I definitely agree with you, Mel, that I think I know how I receive information. I just want it to be simple. I don't want to have to think a ton about the why all the time. I really want to like just get that simple information so that it is in a way that I understand it and that I can relate to. So yeah, we'd love to. I think that there's totally chances for us to continue making some really great infographics with your guys' help in the future. So,
and I also think, Grace and Mel, that speaks to, you know, a story doesn't necessarily just mean we are saying it, you know, we're verbally speaking to it. Finding the story is really like trying to find that message and craft that structure in that narrative way. And that can be done, just like you said, through visuals, so through infographics. It can be done through video storytelling. It can be done through writing a story or sharing a presentation. So that's a really great comment. Thanks for sharing that. Anybody else? All right, thank you so much, everyone. I'll send out an evaluation with some of the resources we chatted about today, and we'll hopefully see you next month.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Amber, for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Grace.